The taste of copper fills my mouth as I press my trembling hands against the broad chest of the most dangerous man in New York City, watching 30 pairs of deadly eyes track my every movement while I perform CPR on a man who could have me killed with a single word, if he were conscious enough to speak it. 20 minutes ago, I was invisible Serafina Cross, the secretary who brought coffee and filed papers in the shadows of Dante Ravencrest's empire. But now I'm kneeling on the polished marble floor of his private office with his life literally in my hands, and every single one of his lieutenants is watching me decide whether their boss lives or dies. The morning had started like any other in the gleaming fortress that Dante calls his corporate headquarters, a 40-story monument to legitimate business that masks the darker enterprises flowing like blood through its veins. I had been organizing files in the outer office, my fingers dancing across documents that held secrets worth killing for, when the shouting began behind the massive oak doors that separate Dante's inner sanctum from the rest of the world. The voices were harsh and accusatory, punctuated by the kind of silences that make your skin crawl, because you know someone is calculating whether violence is the answer to whatever problem has been laid before them. Through the frosted glass, I could see the shadows of powerful men gesticulating wildly, their movements sharp and aggressive like predators circling wounded prey. And I found myself holding my breath as I tried to make out individual words through the soundproofed barriers that Dante had installed specifically to keep conversations like this one from reaching unworthy ears. The Torino brothers were in there, Marco and Vincent, along with representatives from the Castellano family, and what looked like half of Dante's most trusted enforcers, all gathered for what was supposed to be a peaceful negotiation over territory disputes that had been escalating for months. I should have known that nothing involving the Torinos ever stayed peaceful for long, especially when millions of dollars in drug trafficking revenue hung in the balance like a sword waiting to fall. My hands had been shaking as I pretended to focus on spreadsheets that detailed legitimate shipping manifests, though we both knew they were cover stories for cargo containers, filled with everything from heroin to human beings. And I could feel the tension in the air, growing thicker with each passing minute until it felt like breathing through wet concrete. Then the doors had exploded open, and Marco Torino came storming out with his face twisted in fury, his expensive Italian suit wrinkled, and his usually perfect hair disheveled as if someone had grabbed him by the collar. "This isn't over, Ravencrest," he had snarled over his shoulder, his voice carrying the kind of promise that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "You think you can dictate terms to families that have been running this city since before you were born, but you're going to learn that respect isn't something you can buy or intimidate your way into." Vincent had followed his brother out, along with the other visiting family members, their faces dark with the kind of rage that usually ended in newspaper headlines about mysterious disappearances and bodies washing up in the East River. I had kept my eyes down, focusing on my computer screen, as if the quarterly shipping reports were the most fascinating documents in the world, knowing instinctively that making eye contact with any of these men in their current state would be like painting a target on my forehead. But then something had changed in the quality of silence coming from Dante's office, a stillness that felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate, like the moment before lightning strikes when all the birds stop singing and the air itself seems to hold its breath. The remaining men, Dante's most loyal soldiers and advisors, should have been discussing damage control or planning retaliation, but instead there was nothing. Just an emptiness that made my skin prickle with nameless dread. That's when I heard the sound that would haunt my dreams forever. A heavy thud followed by chairs scraping across marble and voices raised in panic. The kind of fear that cuts through even the most hardened criminals when they realize their source of power and protection might be slipping away. "Boss! Jesus Christ, somebody call—" The voice cut off abruptly, and I could picture one of them remembering that calling 911 wasn't exactly an option when your employer's pulse might be checked by paramedics, who would undoubtedly notice the concealed weapons and suspicious documents scattered around his private office. My training as a former nursing student kicked in before my common sense could stop me, and I found myself pushing through the heavy oak doors without permission. my heart hammering against my ribs as I took in the scene that greeted me. Dante Ravencrest, the man who commanded fear and respect from everyone from Wall Street executives to street-level drug dealers, was lying unconscious on his back, beside his massive mahogany desk, his usually perfect black hair falling across his forehead, and his olive-toned skin looking gray and clammy in the afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Around him stood a circle of dangerous men who looked completely lost without their leader's commanding presence to guide them, their faces pale beneath permanent tans earned through years of conducting business in countries where winter didn't exist, and extradition treaties were more suggestions than legal requirements. These were killers and enforcers, men who could make problems disappear with a phone call or a well-placed bullet. But faced with their boss's medical emergency, they were as helpless as children watching their father collapse. "What are you standing around for?" I snapped, surprising myself with the authority in my voice as I dropped to my knees beside Dante's motionless form, my hands already moving to check for vital signs while my mind catalogued everything I could remember from my abbreviated medical training. How long has he been unconscious? Was he complaining of chest pain? Difficulty breathing? Did anyone see what happened? The questions tumbled out of me in rapid succession as I pressed my fingers against the pulse point in his neck, feeling for the thread of life that would tell me whether we were dealing with a heart attack, stroke, or something else entirely. His skin was cold and damp beneath my touch, and I could barely detect the flutter of his pulse, weak and irregular like a bird with a broken wing trying to take flight. "He just collapsed," stammered Tony Marcello, one of Dante's longest-serving lieutenants, a man who had personally eliminated more rivals than most people had hot dinners, but now looked like he might faint at any moment. One second he was telling the Torinos where they could shove their territorial demands, and the next he was grabbing his chest and going down like a sack of concrete. My hands moved without conscious direction, tilting Dante's head back to clear his airway, while I checked for breathing that came in shallow, barely perceptible gasps. Everything I had learned during my brief stint in nursing school came flooding back. The systematic approach to cardiac emergencies, the importance of maintaining blood flow to the brain, the critical window we had before irreversible damage set in. But this wasn't a sterile hospital room with monitors and backup equipment. This was the lion's den, and I was performing emergency medicine on the king of beasts while his pack watched every move I made. "Call his private doctor," I ordered, not caring that I was giving commands to men who could have me killed for looking at them wrong, let alone telling them what to do. "And clear some space. I need room to work." My hands were already positioned over Dante's sternum, fingers interlocked the way they had taught us in CPR certification, and I began the rhythmic compressions that might be the only thing standing between this powerful, dangerous man and whatever afterlife awaited crime lords who had spent their careers trafficking in death and suffering. The sound of my hands pressing against his chest echoed through the silent office like gunshots, each compression a desperate attempt to manually pump blood through arteries that his heart could no longer service on its own. 30 compressions, 2 rescue breaths, then 30 more. The mechanical rhythm that had been drilled into me until it became as automatic as breathing, though nothing had prepared me for the surreal experience of performing it on a man whose orders had probably ended more lives than a medieval plague. Around me, Dante's men formed a loose circle, their faces a mixture of fascination and terror as they watched their untouchable boss reduced to this most human of vulnerabilities. Some of them were probably calculating how quickly they could consolidate power if he died, while others were genuinely worried about losing the only leader who had managed to bring stability to their chaotic world. But all of them were watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, knowing that my success or failure in the next few minutes would determine not just Dante's fate, but quite possibly my own. "Come on," I whispered between compressions, my voice barely audible even to myself, as sweat began to bead along my hairline, despite the air conditioning that kept the office at a constant 68 degrees. Don't you dare die on me now, you magnificent bastard. The endearment slipped out before I could stop it, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks as I realized that several of the watching men had heard it, their eyebrows rising in surprise at this unexpected display of affection from the quiet secretary they had barely noticed before this moment. But I couldn't think about their reactions or what this might mean for my future employment prospects. Assuming I had any future at all, once word of this incident made its way through the organization. All that mattered was the feeling of Dante's chest rising and falling beneath my hands, the gradual warming of his skin as circulation returned, and the growing strength of his pulse as his heart began to remember how to function without my mechanical assistance. Time stretched like taffy, each second feeling like an hour as I continued the life-saving rhythm, my arms beginning to ache from the repetitive motion, but my determination never wavering. This was Dante Ravencrest, the man who had built an empire from nothing, who commanded respect and fear in equal measure from everyone who knew his name, and I'd be damned if I was going to let him slip away on my watch. Then, just as I was beginning to worry that my efforts might not be enough, his eyelids fluttered open to reveal those piercing silver eyes that had haunted my dreams since the first day I had started working for him. The gaze that met mine was confused and unfocused at first, but as awareness returned to those remarkable eyes, I saw them sharpen with the predatory intelligence that had made him the most powerful crime lord on the East Coast. For a moment that stretched between us like a taut wire, neither of us spoke or moved, and I became acutely aware that I was still kneeling over him, with my hands pressed against his chest, my face mere inches from his as 30 dangerous men watched this intimate tableau unfold. His lips parted slightly, as if he were about to speak, and I found myself leaning closer to catch whatever words might emerge from the man I had just pulled back from the brink of death, knowing instinctively that whatever he said next would change everything between us forever. The first words that passed through Dante Ravencrest's lips as consciousness fully returns to those devastating silver eyes aren't the grateful thanks I might have expected from any normal person whose life had just been saved, but rather a low, dangerous whisper that sends ice water coursing through my veins. You've seen me weak, Serafina, and that presents us both with a rather significant problem. His voice carries that familiar smoky rasp that has always made my pulse quicken during our professional interactions. But now there's an underlying threat woven through each syllable that makes me realize I may have just traded his death for my own. Because in Dante's world, witnessing vulnerability is apparently a crime, punishable by whatever creative methods his imagination can devise. The 30 pairs of eyes that had been watching my desperate attempts to restart his heart are now focused entirely on this tense exchange between us, and I can practically feel the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on my shoulders like a physical force as I remain frozen in my position above him, my hands still resting on his chest where I can feel his heartbeat growing stronger and more regular with each passing second. The men surrounding us have probably witnessed executions that started with conversations exactly like this one, and I find myself wondering if they're mentally preparing to dispose of my body, or if they're simply curious to see how their boss will handle the unprecedented situation of owing his life to someone who now possesses dangerous knowledge about his mortality. I begin, then stop myself as I realize that anything I say right now could be interpreted as either an attempt to leverage his gratitude or a plea for mercy, neither of which seems likely to improve my increasingly precarious position in this room full of professional killers who are probably already calculating how to eliminate the security risk I represent. My mouth feels dry as desert sand, and I can hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears so loudly that I'm surprised it isn't drowning out the sound of my voice as I finally manage to form coherent words. I was just doing what anyone would have done in the same situation. The laugh that escapes from Dante's throat is rich and dark like expensive whiskey, but there's no humor in it whatsoever as he slowly pushes himself up to a sitting position, forcing me to rock back on my heels to give him space while keeping my hands ready to steady him if his strength fails again. Anyone would have stood there and watched me die rather than risk getting involved in something that wasn't their concern. He corrects me with the kind of certainty that comes from years of observing how people react when faced with the choice between self-preservation and moral obligation. But you, my dear secretary, chose to break protocol and insert yourself into a situation that could have easily resulted in your own demise if my recovery hadn't gone according to plan. The casual endearment sends an unwelcome thrill through my chest even as his words confirm my worst fears about the consequences of my impulsive decision to save his life. And I find myself caught between the intoxicating proximity to this dangerous, powerful man and the growing realization that my act of mercy may have just signed my death warrant. His silver eyes are studying my face with an intensity that makes me feel like he's reading my thoughts directly from my expressions, cataloging every micro-expression and nervous gesture as data points in whatever calculation he's performing to determine my ultimate fate. "Tony," Dante says without taking his eyes off mine, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that makes grown men jump to attention even when he's sitting on the floor of his office, having just recovered from what appeared to be a massive cardiac event. "Clear the room and make sure we're not disturbed for the next hour. Then have Dr. Castelletti brought up through the private elevator. And Tony, if anyone asks what happened here today, the official story is that I was reviewing quarterly reports and lost track of time." The sound of expensive Italian leather shoes moving across marble fills the silence as his men file out of the office with the kind of military precision that speaks to years of following orders without question. But I can feel their reluctance to leave their boss alone with someone who now possesses intimate knowledge of his vulnerability. The heavy oak doors close with a finality that seems to seal my fate, leaving me alone with Dante Ravencrest in his private domain, where so many important decisions about life and death have been made. And I realize that whatever happens next will determine not just my immediate future, but quite possibly whether I have any future at all. "Help me to the couch," Dante instructs, extending one perfectly manicured hand toward me in a gesture that could be interpreted as either a request for assistance or a command that brooks no refusal. His movements are still slightly unsteady as I wrap my arm around his waist to support his weight, and the contact sends an electric shock through my nervous system that has absolutely nothing to do with the life or death situation we've just navigated together, and everything to do with the fact that I'm finally touching the man who has occupied far too many of my private fantasies over the past 18 months of employment. The leather couch in his office probably costs more than most people make in a year, and as I help him settle against the buttery soft cushions, I can't help but notice how the afternoon sunlight streaming through his floor-to-ceiling windows highlights the sharp angles of his jaw, and the way his dark hair falls across his forehead in a manner that makes him look younger and somehow more approachable than the intimidating crime lord who commands fear and respect throughout the city. But then he speaks again, and the artist's illusion of vulnerability shatters like glass against concrete. "Sit down, Serafina," he orders, gesturing toward the chair across from him with the kind of casual authority that reminds me exactly who I'm dealing with, and I find myself obeying without conscious thought, my body responding to the command in his voice even as my mind races through all the possible reasons why he might want to have this conversation in private. "We need to discuss what you witnessed today and how we're going to handle the complications that arise from your newfound knowledge about my medical condition." The phrase medical condition hangs in the air between us like a loaded weapon, and I realize that he's referring to whatever caused his collapse, with the kind of clinical detachment that suggests this isn't the first time he's had to deal with the implications of his mortality in a world where showing weakness can be a death sentence. My nursing training is screaming at me to ask about symptoms and medical history, to recommend immediate hospitalization and a full cardiac workup. But the predatory stillness in his silver eyes warns me that playing doctor right now might not be the wisest course of action. "I don't understand what complications you're referring to," I lie, even though we both know perfectly well that I understand the situation with crystal clarity. That in his world, knowledge equals power and liability in equal measure, and my possession of information about his vulnerability makes me either an asset to be controlled or a threat to be eliminated. I saw you collapse. I administered CPR as I was trained to do, and you recovered. I don't see how that creates any problems that need to be addressed. The smile that curves across his lips is absolutely predatory. The kind of expression that probably appears on his face just before he orders someone to be fed to the fishes in the Hudson River. And I feel my pulse accelerate as he leans forward slightly, closing the distance between us until I can smell his cologne mixed with the lingering scent of fear sweat from his medical episode. The problem, my dear secretary, is that you now know something about me that could be used as a weapon by my enemies. And more importantly, you've demonstrated a level of quick thinking and medical knowledge that suggests you're far more valuable than the simple filing clerk I thought I was employing. The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow, and I realize that my attempt to save his life has somehow transformed me from an invisible employee into someone worthy of his direct attention, which, given his reputation for ruthlessness, may not be the promotion I would have chosen if given the option. But there's something else in his expression now, a calculating intensity that makes me think he's seeing me as a person for the first time, rather than just another piece of office furniture. And the heat in his gaze sends an unwelcome thrill through my chest that I desperately try to suppress. I was a nursing student before I came to work here, I admit, figuring that honesty might be my best strategy for survival in this impossible situation, though I'm careful not to mention the real reasons why I left medical school, or the circumstances that led me to seek employment in his organization. I never finished the program, but I retained enough knowledge to recognize a cardiac emergency when I saw one, and my training took over before I had time to think about the potential consequences of getting involved. His silver eyes narrow slightly as he processes this information, and I can practically see the gears turning in his mind as he recalculates whatever assessment he had made of my capabilities and potential usefulness to his organization. A nursing student, he repeats slowly, as if testing the words to see how they taste on his tongue. That explains your competence under pressure, but it raises questions about why someone with medical training would choose to work as a secretary in a shipping company rather than pursuing a career in healthcare. The question hangs between us like a blade waiting to fall, and I realize that he's not just making conversation, but rather conducting an interrogation disguised as casual inquiry, probing for weaknesses or inconsistencies in my story that might reveal hidden motivations for seeking employment with his organization. My mouth goes dry as I scramble for a response that will satisfy his curiosity without revealing the truth about my past. That I'm drowning in student loans from a degree I couldn't complete. That my father's gambling debts have left my family under threat from loan sharks, and that I took this job specifically because the salary was generous enough to keep both of us alive. Personal circumstances made it impossible for me to continue my education. I finally manage, hoping that the vague answer will discourage further probing into territory that I'd prefer to keep private. I needed steady income, and your company offered better compensation than most entry-level positions in the healthcare field, so I made a practical decision based on financial necessity rather than career passion. The explanation seems to satisfy him for the moment, though I can see him filing away the information for future reference, and I realize that working for Dante Ravencrest means being under constant surveillance and evaluation, even when you think you're having a casual conversation. But then his expression shifts into something I can't quite read, a mixture of calculation and what might almost be genuine gratitude. And when he speaks again, his voice carries a warmth that I've never heard from him before. Regardless of your reasons for being here, Serafina, the fact remains that you saved my life today when my own men were too shocked to act, and that creates a debt between us that I intend to repay appropriately. His words should be comforting, but something in his tone sends warning bells ringing through my consciousness, because in his world, debts are rarely repaid in ways that benefit the creditor. From this moment forward, you'll be working as my personal assistant rather than general office staff, which means you'll have access to information and responsibilities that require a much higher level of trust and discretion. The promotion sounds like an honor until I realize what it actually means. That I'm being moved from the relative safety of anonymity into the dangerous inner circle where loyalty is tested regularly and betrayal is punished creatively. But before I can process the full implications of this development, he continues speaking in a voice that has dropped to a dangerous whisper that makes my skin prickle with awareness. Of course, your new position will also require you to be available at all hours, should my medical condition require attention again, which means you'll be staying in the penthouse apartment adjacent to my private quarters, where I can ensure your safety at all times. The pause before the word safety makes it clear that he's not talking about protection from external threats, but rather about keeping me under close surveillance to prevent me from sharing what I've learned about his vulnerability. I trust that won't be a problem for someone who values financial security over career passion. The question is clearly rhetorical, and as I meet his silver gaze, I realize that I'm no longer just Dante Ravencrest's secretary. I'm his beautiful prisoner, trapped by the very act of mercy that saved his life, and the predatory satisfaction in his smile tells me that he knows exactly how thoroughly he's just turned my good deed into the bars of my own cage. Living in the shadow of Dante Ravencrest's penthouse feels like being trapped inside a luxurious gilded cage where every surface gleams with the kind of wealth that most people only see in magazines. Yet I find myself constantly aware that the silk curtains and Italian marble floors are merely beautiful camouflage for the prison I've somehow constructed around myself through a single act of life-saving compassion. My new quarters occupy the eastern wing of his private floor, connected to his master suite through a series of corridors that feel like arteries pumping the lifeblood of danger through this elevated fortress. And though the apartment itself is larger and more opulent than any place I've ever called home, I can't escape the feeling that I'm being watched and evaluated every moment of every day by invisible eyes that catalog my every movement for future reference. The first week of my new position as Dante's personal assistant passes in a blur of meetings that would make most people's hair curl with terror. As I sit quietly in corners taking notes while he conducts business with representatives from families whose names appear regularly in newspaper obituaries and police missing persons reports. These aren't the sanitized corporate negotiations I had witnessed from the outer office, but rather raw displays of power where threats are delivered with the same casual tone most people use to discuss the weather. And I find myself simultaneously horrified and fascinated by the elegant brutality with which Dante navigates conversations that could end with bodies floating in the East River if the wrong word is spoken at the wrong moment. He moves through his dangerous world with the fluid grace of a predator who has never encountered anything he couldn't either buy, intimidate, or eliminate. And watching him conduct these deadly negotiations, while knowing that I'm the only person who has seen him vulnerable, creates an intimacy between us that crackles with unspoken tension every time our eyes meet across a conference table filled with killers. During a particularly heated discussion about territorial disputes with the Castellano family, I notice the way his fingers unconsciously massage his chest in the exact spot where I performed CPR, and the gesture sends an unexpected jolt of possessive satisfaction through my system, as I realize that my touch has left a permanent mark on the most untouchable man in the city. But it's during the quiet moments between meetings, when we're alone in his private office reviewing documents that detail everything from legitimate shipping manifests to coded communications about arms deals, that I begin to understand the true complexity of the man I've somehow become entangled with through circumstances neither of us could have predicted. His intelligence is razor-sharp and multifaceted, capable of switching from discussing international finance to planning strategic eliminations with the same ease that most people transition from coffee to lunch. And I find myself drawn into conversations that reveal layers of sophistication and cultural knowledge that extend far beyond the stereotype of a brutish crime lord. "You're staring again, Serafina," he observes, without looking up from the financial reports spread across his mahogany desk, his voice carrying that familiar hint of amusement that makes my pulse quicken in ways that have nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the growing attraction I'm desperately trying to suppress. "I'm beginning to think that saving my life has given you the impression that you have some kind of proprietary interest in monitoring my vital signs on a continuous basis." The heat that rushes to my cheeks at being caught would be embarrassing under normal circumstances. But there's something in his tone that suggests he's not entirely displeased by my attention. And I find myself wondering if the magnetic pull I feel whenever he's in the room is entirely one-sided, or if there's something mutual developing between us, despite the dangerous power dynamic that governs every aspect of our relationship. I was simply observing your stress responses during the Castellano negotiation, I reply, hoping my voice sounds more professional than I feel. Your heart rate elevated significantly when Vincent mentioned the warehouse incident, and given your recent medical episode, I thought it was important to monitor any potential triggers. The explanation is partially true, though I'm careful not to mention that I was also noticing the way his jaw tightens when he's calculating whether violence is necessary, or how his silver eyes seem to darken to molten steel when someone challenges his authority, or the way he unconsciously straightens his tie before delivering threats that could end careers or lives depending on his mood. These observations have nothing to do with medical monitoring and everything to do with the fact that I'm becoming dangerously fascinated by every aspect of his personality, from the brilliant strategic mind that built his empire to the carefully controlled violence that maintains it. My stress responses, he repeats slowly, finally looking up from his papers to fix me with that penetrating stare that always makes me feel like he's reading thoughts I didn't even know I was thinking. Tell me, Dr. Cross, what other stress responses have you observed during your medical surveillance of my daily activities? The mock title he uses is clearly intended to remind me of my incomplete medical training, but there's something almost playful in his delivery that makes my heart skip beats for entirely different reasons than the fear that usually accompanies our conversations. Before I can formulate a response that won't reveal how closely I've been studying him, his secure phone buzzes with the kind of urgent alert that usually means someone is either dead or about to be, and the predatory stillness that settles over his features reminds me that no matter how intimate our conversations become, he's still the apex predator in a world where weakness equals death. Marco Torino wants to arrange a private meeting, he says after reading the message, and something in his expression makes my blood run cold because I remember the fury on Marco's face when he stormed out of the office just before Dante's collapse. That seems like an unnecessarily dangerous risk given the circumstances of your last interaction, I point out, surprised by my own boldness in questioning his judgment about matters that could get us both killed if I'm wrong about the wisdom of expressing concern for his safety. He was clearly furious when he left here last week, and now he's requesting a meeting outside your usual security parameters. It feels like a setup. The smile that crosses Dante's face is absolutely predatory, the expression of a man who has built his entire career on walking into dangerous situations and emerging victorious through a combination of superior planning and ruthless execution. Of course it's a setup, my dear assistant, but Marco has underestimated both my intelligence and my resources if he thinks I'll walk into his trap without adequate preparation. His fingers drum against the desk in a rhythm that I'm beginning to recognize as his thinking pattern, and I realize that he's not just accepting the meeting, but actually looking forward to whatever confrontation Marco has planned. The meeting is arranged for the following evening at Paradiso, an upscale Italian restaurant that serves as neutral ground for family business, because the owner has connections to every major crime organization on the East Coast and maintains strict policies about violence on his premises. I spend the day before researching everything I can find about Marco Torino's recent activities, using the access privileges that come with my new position to dig through financial records and communication logs that reveal a pattern of suspicious contacts with rival families and unexplained cash transfers that suggest someone is paying him substantial sums for information or services. When I present my findings to Dante in his private office that afternoon, spreading the printed documents across his desk like evidence in a criminal trial, I watch his silver eyes grow cold and calculating as he processes the implications of what I've discovered. "Excellent work, Serafina," he says quietly, but there's something dangerous in his tone that makes me realize my research has confirmed suspicions he was already harboring about his lieutenant's loyalty. It appears that Marco's desire for a private meeting is motivated by more than simple business disagreements. The evening of the meeting arrives with the kind of autumn chill that makes the city feel sharp and dangerous, and as I help Dante adjust his tie in the mirror of his dressing room, I'm struck by how the ritual feels simultaneously intimate and ominous, like I'm preparing him for battle rather than dinner. His reflection meets my eyes in the glass, and for a moment the carefully maintained distance between us seems to dissolve as he reaches up to cover my hands with his own, his touch warm and surprisingly gentle for someone capable of such calculated violence. If something goes wrong tonight, Serafina, I want you to know that having you by my side these past weeks has been... He pauses, seemingly searching for words that don't come easily to a man who typically expresses himself through actions rather than emotional declarations. Having someone I can trust in my corner has been more valuable than I expected when I first decided to keep you close for security reasons. The admission hangs between us like a bridge across dangerous waters, and I find myself stepping closer until there's barely an inch of space separating us, close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in his silver eyes and to feel the heat radiating from his body through his perfectly tailored suit. Nothing is going to happen to you tonight, I whisper with a conviction I don't entirely feel, my hands still trapped beneath his on the knot of his tie. I won't let it. The kiss happens so quickly that I don't have time to think about the wisdom or consequences of crossing this particular line, his mouth claiming mine with a hunger that speaks to weeks of building tension and carefully suppressed desire. And suddenly I'm pressed against the mirror with his body caging me in while his hands tangle in my hair with a desperation that makes my knees weak. The taste of him is everything I've imagined during the lonely nights in my gilded cage. Whiskey and danger and something uniquely masculine that makes my head spin with want. And when he finally pulls back to stare down at me with eyes that have darkened to storm clouds, I realize that everything between us has just changed in ways that cannot be undone. We should go, he says finally, though his hands remain framed around my face, and his thumb traces my lower lip with a possessiveness that sends heat pooling in places I shouldn't be thinking about when he's about to walk into what might be an assassination attempt. Marco will interpret any delay as weakness or fear, and I prefer to let my enemies underestimate me until it's too late for them to correct their miscalculations. The restaurant is exactly as elegant and dangerous as I expected, filled with the kind of carefully dressed patrons who conduct business that never appears on tax returns and settle disputes through methods that don't involve lawyers or courtrooms. Marco Torino is already seated at a corner table when we arrive, his expensive suit and perfect grooming doing little to disguise the predatory anticipation in his dark eyes as he watches Dante approach with me trailing slightly behind, like a well-dressed shadow. But as the evening progresses, and the conversation grows increasingly tense beneath the veneer of civilized dining, I begin to notice details that make my nursing training scream warnings into my consciousness. The way Marco's pupils are slightly dilated despite the restaurant's dim lighting, the faint tremor in his hands when he reaches for his wine glass, and most disturbing of all, the small adhesive patch barely visible beneath his shirt collar that could easily be hiding a needle mark from a recent injection. When Marco excuses himself to visit the restroom midway through the meal, I lean close to Dante and whisper urgently, "He's been drugged or he's on something. His physical responses are all wrong for someone having a casual business dinner." But before Dante can respond, Marco returns with a fresh bottle of wine and a smile that doesn't reach his eyes, and I watch in growing horror as he personally pours glasses for all three of us, while maintaining eye contact with Dante in a way that feels like a challenge. "To old friendships and new opportunities," Marco toasts, raising his glass in a gesture that seems innocent, until I notice that he's not drinking from his own wine. And suddenly every instinct I possess is screaming that we're about to witness another attempt on Dante's life, this time orchestrated by someone close enough to know exactly how to exploit his trust and get close enough to finish what the previous attack had started. The crystal wine glass shatters against the marble floor with a sound like breaking promises as I lunge across the table to knock it from Dante's lips, just as he's about to take his first sip. My nursing instincts screaming through every nerve ending that the pale liquid Marco Torino has just poured contains something far more deadly than fermented grapes. And the shock that flashes across both men's faces in that suspended moment tells me everything I need to know about how close we just came to repeating the medical emergency that brought us together in the first place. Marco's carefully constructed mask of friendly concern dissolves instantly into something feral and desperate as he realizes his plan has been exposed. And I watch his hand move toward the concealed weapon I'm now certain he's carrying, while Dante's silver eyes harden into chips of winter ice that promise a level of retribution that will make Marco's death a cautionary tale, whispered in dark corners for decades to come. "You poisoned the wine," I state with the kind of clinical certainty that comes from recognizing symptoms I was trained to identify, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent restaurant as other patrons begin to sense that the elegant dinner they've been witnessing is about to transform into something far more violent and permanent. "The same compound you used to trigger his cardiac episode last week, probably administered through a delayed release mechanism that would have made it look like natural heart failure. Except this time, you calculated the dosage to ensure there wouldn't be any miraculous recoveries." The admission that hangs between us like smoke from a discharged gun confirms what I've suspected since I first noticed Marco's dilated pupils and nervous tremors, that Dante's collapse in his office wasn't a random medical event, but rather the opening gambit in an assassination plot orchestrated by someone close enough to know his routines and trusted enough to have access to his private spaces. Marco's face cycles through expressions of rage, fear, and calculation as he weighs his rapidly diminishing options, and I can practically see him deciding that eliminating the witnesses to his betrayal might be his only path to survival in a world where failed coup attempts are typically punished with the kind of creative torture that serves as both revenge and deterrent. "The little nurse is cleverer than I gave her credit for," Marco sneers, his hand now openly reaching for the gun concealed beneath his jacket, while his eyes dart between Dante and me as if calculating which target presents the greater immediate threat to his escape. "But intelligence won't save either of you when Vincent and his men arrive to clean up the mess I've made of this evening. Because unlike my previous attempt, tonight's plan includes contingencies for unexpected complications." The words have barely left his lips when the restaurant's front entrance explodes inward with the kind of coordinated violence that speaks to military training and professional execution. And I realize with growing horror that Marco's backup plan involves turning this elegant dining establishment into a war zone where innocent bystanders will become collateral damage in his desperate attempt to eliminate the only man standing between him and control of Dante's empire. The screams of terrified patrons mix with the sharp crack of gunfire as Vincent Torino's soldiers pour through the shattered doorway like a plague of locusts, their weapons already drawn and their faces set in the emotionless masks that professional killers wear when conducting business that requires absolute focus and ruthless efficiency. But what Marco hasn't anticipated is that Dante Ravencrest didn't survive 2 decades in the most dangerous business in the world by walking into obvious traps without adequate preparation. And even as chaos erupts around us, I can see his own security team emerging from concealed positions throughout the restaurant, like deadly flowers blooming in a garden of violence. The ensuing firefight transforms the elegant dining room into something resembling a medieval battlefield, with overturned tables serving as improvised barricades, while the kind of high-powered weapons that are usually reserved for military conflicts reduce priceless artwork and crystal chandeliers to glittering debris that rains down on combatants and civilians alike. Through the mayhem of automatic weapons fire and tactical movements that speak to years of training in environments where hesitation equals death, I watch Dante transform from the sophisticated businessman who kissed me in his dressing room into something primal and terrifying, his movements fluid and precise, as he eliminates threats with the kind of brutal efficiency that reminds me exactly why he commands fear and respect from every criminal organization on the eastern seaboard. But even as his men gain the upper hand in the firefight, Marco manages to slip away in the confusion, and I realize with sick certainty that he's heading for the kitchen exit where a getaway vehicle is probably waiting to spirit him away to whatever safe house he's prepared for this contingency. "Stay down," Dante orders as he prepares to pursue his treacherous lieutenant. But something in Marco's desperate expression during his final moments in the dining room makes me realize that this confrontation is far from over, and that his escape might be part of an even larger plan designed to draw Dante away from his security team and into a kill zone where superior numbers and preparation will overcome even his legendary survival instincts. "Marco's running scared now, and scared men make mistakes that get them killed, but I need you safe while I finish cleaning up this mess." But as I crouch behind an overturned table while bullets whine overhead like angry hornets, I catch a glimpse of something that makes my blood freeze in my veins. A photograph that has fallen from Marco's jacket during the struggle, showing a young woman with dark hair and silver eyes who bears such a striking resemblance to Dante that she could only be a close relative, and written across the bottom in Marco's handwriting are the words that make everything click into place with terrifying clarity. "Sophia Ravencrest, the sister you couldn't save, and the face of your greatest failure." The revelation hits me like a physical blow as I realize that I'm staring at my own reflection in the features of a dead woman. And suddenly Marco's final words before he disappeared into the chaos take on a significance that makes my hands shake with something far beyond fear. "She's not who you think she is, Dante. She's the ghost of your past come back to destroy your future. And by the time you realize the truth, it will be too late to save either of you." The truth shatters between us like glass hitting concrete as I hold the photograph with trembling fingers, staring at the face of Sophia Ravencrest, while Dante's silver eyes move between the image and my features with a mixture of recognition and horror that makes my chest feel like it's being crushed by invisible hands. Because now I understand why Marco orchestrated this elaborate assassination plot, and why he was so confident that revealing my identity would destroy Dante more completely than any poison or bullet ever could. The woman in the photograph could be my twin. The same dark hair that catches light like silk. The same delicate bone structure that speaks to Italian ancestry. The same silver-gray eyes that seem to hold secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. And as the pieces of this impossible puzzle click into place with nauseating clarity, I realize that my resemblance to his dead sister isn't coincidence, but rather the foundation of a revenge plot so twisted and elaborate that it took years to orchestrate properly. "My father," I whisper, the words tasting like ash and betrayal as they fall from my lips, "was Antonio Cross, wasn't he? The man who killed Sophia during the warehouse raid 5 years ago. And when Marco discovered my identity during a routine background check, he saw an opportunity to use me as a weapon against you in ways that would destroy your mind and soul, rather than just ending your life." The admission hangs between us like a blade waiting to fall, and I can see the exact moment when Dante's carefully constructed emotional walls begin to crumble as he processes the implications of what I've just revealed. The way his face cycles through expressions of rage, betrayal, and something that might be heartbreak if men like him were capable of such vulnerable emotions. But instead of the explosion of violence I expect, instead of the righteous fury that should consume him when faced with the daughter of his sister's killer, Dante does something that breaks my heart in ways I never expected. He reaches out with hands that shake slightly and cups my face between his palms as if I'm something precious and fragile that might disappear if he doesn't hold on tight enough. "I know," he says quietly, his voice rough with emotions that have been carefully buried for years, but are now clawing their way to the surface despite his legendary self-control. "I've known since the first week you worked for me, because I had you investigated the moment I realized how closely you resembled her. And when I learned who your father was, I should have had you killed immediately to close that chapter of my past forever. The confession should terrify me, should send me running for whatever safety I can find in a world where my very existence represents an open wound in the psyche of the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard. But instead I find myself leaning into his touch, as if his hands are the only things anchoring me to reality in a universe that has suddenly become far more complicated and deadly than I ever imagined possible. Then why didn't you? I ask, though part of me already knows the answer from the way his silver eyes search my face as if he's trying to memorize every detail before some inevitable separation tears us apart forever. Why keep me close when every moment you looked at me must have been like staring at a ghost that reminds you of your greatest failure and deepest pain? His laugh is bitter and broken, the sound of a man who has spent years convincing himself that revenge and power could fill the Sophia-shaped hole in his soul, only to discover that salvation might come in the form of the one person he should hate more than anyone else in the world. Because watching you, being near you, it wasn't like having Sophia back, he explains, his thumbs tracing the lines of my cheekbones with a tenderness that seems impossible from hands that have orchestrated so much death and destruction. It was like discovering that the universe had given me a chance to protect someone who looked like her, but was entirely, beautifully, courageously you. And falling in love with you has been both the most terrifying and the most healing experience of my life. The words hit me like lightning, illuminating truths I've been afraid to acknowledge even to myself. During the weeks we've spent circling each other like satellites, caught in a gravitational pull, too strong to escape but too dangerous to surrender to completely. But before I can respond, before I can tell him that I've been falling just as hard, despite knowing that loving him means accepting a life lived in shadows and violence, the sound of approaching sirens cuts through the aftermath of the restaurant battle like a warning bell. And I realize that Marco's final gambit is about to play out in ways that will test every bond we've forged in blood and bullets and desperate salvation. He's not finished, I say, pulling away from Dante's touch just enough to focus on the immediate danger, while keeping my hands pressed against his chest, where I can feel his heart beating strong and steady beneath my palms. Marco knew that revealing my identity wouldn't be enough to destroy you, so he's planned something else. Something that will force you to choose between me and everything you've built. Because men like him understand that sometimes the cruelest torture is making someone choose between love and survival. The realization that follows feels like stepping off a cliff into darkness. But as I meet Dante's silver gaze and see my own determination reflected there, I understand that some choices aren't really choices at all. They're simply the moment when you stop running from who you're meant to become and embrace the darkness or light that defines your true nature. I'm going to find my father, I tell him with a certainty that surprises us both. And I'm going to end this the way it should have ended 5 years ago, because you shouldn't have to carry the weight of Sophia's death and my father's crimes when I'm finally strong enough to balance the scales myself. The confrontation with Antonio Cross happens in the abandoned warehouse where he's been hiding since Marco's plan began to unravel. And as I stand over his body with his blood on my hands and Dante's arms around me in the aftermath, I realize that salvation doesn't always come through forgiveness and redemption. Sometimes it comes through accepting the darkness within yourself and using it to protect the light you've found in someone else. We are broken people who have found wholeness in each other's shadows, two souls forged in violence and tragedy, who have discovered that love can bloom even in the darkest corners of the human experience. And as we stand together in the ruins of our separate pasts, I know that whatever future we build will be constructed from equal parts tenderness and brutality, passion and pragmatism, salvation and sin. In the end, we are exactly what the world made us, survivors who found each other in the darkness and chose to create our own light. No matter how much blood it cost, or how many moral boundaries we had to cross to reach the place where love and loyalty intersect with power and protection. Because sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the richest soil, and ours has been fertilized with enough pain and sacrifice to nurture something truly extraordinary. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse bedroom catches the diamond on my left hand in a way that sends fractals of light dancing across the silk sheets. And as I watch Dante sleep beside me with his dark hair tousled and his face relaxed in a way that only happens when he trusts completely in his safety, I find myself marveling at how two people who met through violence and deception could build something so beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The ring itself is a work of art. a flawless 3-carat stone surrounded by smaller diamonds arranged in a pattern that resembles a heart, though Dante insisted on having it custom-made with a secret compartment that contains a tiny vial of poison, because even our most romantic gestures must acknowledge the dangerous world we inhabit together as equal partners in love and lethality. The newspaper on the nightstand carries headlines about the mysterious disappearance of the Torino brothers and the subsequent consolidation of their territory under Dante's control, though the journalists who write these stories have no idea that the elegant woman often photographed on his arm during charity galas and cultural events is the same person who helped plan the strategic eliminations that removed his enemies from the chessboard of New York's criminal underworld. I have become his most trusted advisor and deadliest weapon, the queen to his king in a game where the stakes are measured in lives rather than dollars, and the transformation from frightened secretary to crime lord's partner has been both terrifying and intoxicating in ways I never could have imagined when I first knelt beside his unconscious body in that marble-floored office. Our wedding is scheduled for next month in the private chapel of his estate in the Hamptons, a ceremony that will be attended by senators and federal judges alongside representatives from every major criminal organization on the eastern seaboard. Because Dante's world operates according to rules that blur the lines between legitimate business and organized crime until the distinction becomes meaningless. The guest list reads like a who's who of American power brokers, but I know that many of them will be carrying concealed weapons beneath their designer suits, and our security team has been planning for months to ensure that our vows are exchanged without anyone ending up dead in the rose garden. My medical training has proven invaluable in ways neither of us anticipated when he first decided to keep me close for security reasons, because maintaining the health and longevity of a crime lord requires skills that extend far beyond basic first aid, to include everything from treating gunshot wounds to administering cardiac medications during high-stress negotiations. I've become his personal physician as well as his partner, monitoring his heart condition with the same dedication I once applied to saving his life. And the intimacy of caring for his physical well-being has created bonds between us that go deeper than passion or shared danger to touch something fundamental about trust and vulnerability. The penthouse has been renovated to accommodate my new role as his equal rather than his beautiful prisoner, with a medical suite disguised as a home spa and a private office where I review intelligence reports and plan operations that require a woman's touch to execute properly. My nursing background has opened doors in the legitimate medical community that provide perfect cover for money laundering operations, while my natural empathy and emotional intelligence have made me invaluable in negotiations where feminine charm can accomplish what masculine intimidation cannot. But perhaps the most unexpected development in our twisted fairy tale has been the discovery that love really can flourish in the darkest places, nurtured by shared secrets and mutual protection, until it becomes something stronger than either passion or convenience. When Dante holds me in the aftermath of violence, when his hands are gentle despite the blood beneath his fingernails, when he whispers my name like a prayer against my skin, I know that we have found something rare and precious in a world that typically destroys anything beautiful or pure that dares to exist within its boundaries. The photograph of Sophia Ravencrest sits in a silver frame on his nightstand now, no longer a source of pain, but rather a reminder of the sister who would have wanted him to find happiness, even if it came in the most unexpected form imaginable. Sometimes I catch him looking between the photograph and my face with an expression of peaceful acceptance, and I know that he has finally forgiven both himself and fate for the cruel coincidence that brought us together through tragedy and kept us connected through love. As I slip from the bed to prepare for another day of beautiful violence and elegant corruption, I catch sight of my reflection in the antique mirror that dominates one wall of our bedroom, and for just a moment I see the nervous secretary I used to be, superimposed over the confident queen I have become. The transformation is complete now, written in the way I carry myself and the knowledge behind my eyes, and I realize that saving Dante's life was really just the beginning of saving my own soul by learning to embrace the darkness that was always lurking beneath my surface. waiting for the right catalyst to set it free. We are monsters who have found love in the shadows, predators who have learned that the most dangerous hunt is the pursuit of happiness in a world designed to destroy anyone who dares to reach for something beyond mere survival. And as the city awakens below us to another day of secrets and sins, I know that our story will be whispered in the dark corners of this dangerous world as proof that even the damned can find redemption if they're willing to save each other from the demons that created them. In the end, we discovered that the heart wants what it wants, regardless of logic or morality. And sometimes the most beautiful love stories are written in blood by people who understand that true partnership means being willing to kill for each other as readily as they would die for each other. Because in a world where love is the ultimate luxury, we have become each other's most precious and deadly treasure.